Deputy Labor Leader and Shadow Defence Minister Richard Marles, thanks for your time. A lot to talk about today with AusMin at the ministerial meetings in Washington. But first, I want to start with a crisis in your own backyard in Victoria. And you're very critical of the federal government's handling of the aged care crisis that we're seeing right now. More deaths overnight, another 6 deaths. It is a tragedy. What do you want to see the federal government do?
Whatever it takes, Kieran, is the answer to that question. I mean, we've got 769 cases now within our aged care system in Victoria across more than 60 facilities. That is a system which is in crisis. It's a heartbreaking situation for people who find themselves really not being able to say goodbye to their loved ones properly as they're placed in ICUs around Melbourne. For those of us who have loved ones and parents who are in the aged care system right now, I think this is the single most terrifying moment since the pandemic has begun. And a lot of the issues which are in aged care are issues which we've known about for a long time. It's a chronically underfunded sector. Casualisation of the workforce is very significant. But here's the point. This is the responsibility of the Commonwealth Government. This is a moment where Scott Morrison actually needs to make clear what he intends to do, what he seeks to do as Prime Minister, as the head of the responsible government for this section. And I think there is a sense in which you've got the federal government keeping a low profile while this crisis unfolds in Victoria more generally. Well, this is an area where we actually need to hear from our Prime Minister today about what he intends to do to make sure that we start bringing into control what is an unfolding crisis across this sector.
But the vulnerability in that sector we've known for some time. This is the at-risk cohort. It really has only been exposed by the catastrophic failure of the quarantining by the Victorian government. Isn't that where the accountability lies in totality?
No, I don't think that's right. I think we had a few months ago an outbreak in Newmarch in New South Wales, and so in that sense, the sorts of issues that were particular to the aged care sector were completely made clear to the government. We've got real problems in terms of the way in which information is being communicated to the families of those who are in the aged care sector, communication about the status of outbreaks in various facilities. But we've also got a failure of communication to the facilities themselves around really important programs, such as making sure that people are not able to work in more than one aged care sector. But, quite apart from the other issues that are playing out in Victoria, we know that this is a sector which has been in crisis. That's why we've got a Royal Commission into aged care right now. And the sorts of issues that is bringing to light are actually being put into stark relief by the COVID-19 crisis. And this is for the Commonwealth Government to solve. It's not enough to be having kind of glib press conferences. We actually need to hear from the Prime Minister about what he is going to do to try and put into some form of control what is an unfolding tragedy in the Victorian aged care sector right now. And this is most certainly the space in which the coronavirus is playing out in obviously the most deadly way within Victoria.
And we've seen that tragedy more broadly than just in Melbourne. We're now seeing it spread through the regions, and Colac, not far from your home in Geelong, we're seeing outbreaks there, and we've received correspondence via Richard Reagan, the local member at the state level, and one individual, 20-year-old from Geelong, wrote to him saying he's waited 10 days for the test results that he had undertaken in Colac because that's where his girlfriend was. But this young man from Geelong waiting 10 days for test results. We've seen email after email of people saying that they're waiting 9-10 days for results. That's not good enough, is it?
Well, I think it is right to say that it's important that results are processed quickly. That's obviously the case when what we're seeking from people is to isolate whilst they are waiting for their results. And obviously when you're talking about the scale of contact tracing which is required in Victoria, it's of a different order of magnitude to anything that we've so far seen anywhere else in the country. But having said that, there are other parts of the world which have had much bigger outbreaks than what we're seeing in Victoria now, where contact tracing remains a really critical tool in trying to make sure that the transmission rate is brought below 1. I mean, this is a very difficult situation that the state government finds itself in. I know that it's doing everything it can to try and make sure that it gets that transmission rate below 1. That's where we need to get to if we're going to start seeing the numbers decline, and both quick processing of testing and contact tracing is going to be central to that.
Now, the AusMin talks, if we turn our attention to foreign policy and defence policy, the Defence Minister and Foreign Minister in Washington for this summit, which comes at a very tense time, both in US-China relations but Australia-China relations. And we've confirmed with the government that they're not going to accede to any US request for freedom of navigation exercises within 12 nautical miles of reclaimed Chinese territory. Is that something that you welcome?
Well, I think the specifics of freedom of navigation operations ultimately are a matter for the government to determine. When it comes to the sort of specifics of an operational request, the how, the when, the why, you really need to be in the chair of government to properly answer that question. I would say that we have said as a matter of principle, which I think you can say from opposition, we've been saying consistently for a number of years that freedom of navigation operations should be on the table, and that's simply to make it a point that as an island trading nation, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is very central to our national interests on the high seas around the world, but particularly in the South China Sea, where most of our trade traverses. And that's where our national interest lies in terms of the issues around the South China Sea. And so I think it's very important that Australia asserts its national interest there. But these AusMin talks are as important as any that have happened in recent years, because I think what COVID-19 has done is act as something of an accelerant around a whole range of trends that were going on in the global sphere, which were making Australia's strategic circumstances increasingly complex. And so it's important that these are happening, and I think it's important that they're happening in person.
Should the Morrison government and those ministers, relevant ministers in Washington, be cautious about hardening any view of China in the context of a US mantra, really, in leading up to this presidential election, that Donald Trump and his administration is very much anti-China, the tit-for-tat shutting down of consulates and so on? Does Australia have to be cautious in that context?
Yeah, I think we do need to be cautious. I actually think it's an important feature of this AusMin that's happening in the context of the US election for this reason, that really the relationship between Australia and the United States transcends the politics of both Australia and the United States. It has endured through governments of both persuasions on both sides of the Pacific. And AusMin has had a pretty good record of continuing even during periods of election in the US and periods of election here in Australia. And so I think it sends an important message of continuity and calm, really, that we're able to have AusMin at this moment. But you're also right that, you know, it would obviously be a mistake for Australia to find itself getting caught up in the immediate politics of the US election. We have our own national interest. It's not determined by whatever the politics are in any given moment in the United States. It's determined by what our national interest is, and we need to have consistent positions about that and make sure that we are articulating our national voice very clearly in relation to that, both in terms of the way in which we express that to a country like China, but also in terms of the way in which we express it in conversations with the United States during AusMin. And so it's very important that we're doing that, and that should obviously have nothing to do with the particular politics of the moment in the United States leading up to their election.
And a couple of other matters before we wrap up. Joel Fitzgibbon, your shadow cabinet colleague, has told my colleague Andrew Clennell that he's knocked back an invitation to speak at the Labor Environment Action Network tomorrow. He believes that there are those trying to infiltrate the Labor Party with extreme ideologies that belong to the Greens, hence his rejection of this invitation. Do you think that there is a group like that of basically Greens seeking to infiltrate your party?
Oh, look, I mean, I think there is within the branches of the Labor Party a healthy debate around a range of issues, including this. But, you know, what's important is that in terms of the parliamentary party, our view is unified and very clear. And Joel has been a fantastic advocate on the part of the resources sector within this country, and that sector has been and will remain critically important to our economy going forward. And Joel makes that point very clearly, and his views around that, you know, don't need any further amplification. And I think that's the point that he was making in not participating in that particular forum, and I can understand that. You know, at the same time, obviously, we see that this country enjoys a very unique, really, renewable energy opportunity in terms of our exposure to the roaring 40s with wind, in terms of the quality of our solar radiation. And so, you know, we see the renewable energy sector as a critical part of our future. But ultimately what the country needs in relation to all of this, and this is the point we've been making for some time, is a settled energy policy. And that's where, if you want to see division within the parliament, you see it on the side of the government, who have been unable to land a settled energy policy, not because of any inability to negotiate with us, but because of their ability to actually land their internals on this issue and bring some form of coherent energy policy to the floor of the parliament. And that's actually what the country needs to see right now.
Just quickly and finally, if I can, there's been a lot of flack heading in the way of the Treasurer for daring to mention two Conservative icons of the 80s in Thatcher and Reagan. But isn't he simply saying that the government's going to provide more support for business? That's as simple as it gets.
Well, I'm not sure what he's saying by virtue of that reference. I mean, I don't mind going back to the period of the 80s, but when you go back to the period of the 80s, the great example you have is the Hawke-Keating government, which really were the architects of modern Australia, and have underpinned the open trading economy that we have today, an economy that experienced the longest run of uninterrupted growth up until this year that we had seen. You know, that's where we should be drawing inspiration. And even back then, when those examples of the Thatcher government and Reaganomics were going on right next to them, Hawke and Keating plotted their own path. They determined what was right for Australia, and that's really where we should be drawing our inspiration. And certainly they didn't take this country down that path. I mean, I think we do need an economic strategy beyond the provision of relief for this economy coming out of the COVID crisis. We're going to come out of this with high unemployment, but massive debt. I mean, debt at a level which is the same as that was proportionately generated by this country in fighting the First World War. I mean, that is a staggering number. And I don't think you get that strategy by adopting, you know, the old formula of industrial relations policy, which seek to attack the contribution that working people make in their workplace. So, you know, I actually think if we want to go to the 80s, let's look at Hawke-Keating, because that's really the inspiration which should guide us going forward.
Richard Marles, as always, appreciate it. Thanks.